Howdy everybody. I've just finished installing the plumbing system here in my new van, and I thought this would be a good time to talk about plumbing. Now, since this is my personal van, in many ways I consider this system that I'm going to show kind of a perfect compromise on function, simplicity, and reliability. Now, plumbing can seem a lot simpler than electrical work up front, and in general I do agree. There's a couple things to point out though, is I think to have a nice and reliable plumbing system, I think there's a lot of nuance and just small details that really help that happen. And once you're actually traveling, most of the electrical issues I see are kind of things you can limp through. Like, you know, if your solar charging goes out, you can still drive to keep your batteries charged up. Or maybe like your lights go out or you have an outlet that doesn't work. These are all things that are inconvenient, but honestly, you know, you can continue a trip with them. However, with plumbing problems, it usually means a leak. And at that point, you know, once you've got a leak somewhere in your system, you're really kind of risking kind of permanent damage to your van if you continue to use your plumbing system. So in that ways, I find plumbing to be more of a headache in that if you have a little bit of a problem, you essentially don't have any water system in your van. So with that, there will be two parts to this video. The second part will have more to do with the actual installation and like some techniques and like what materials I use. But this first part, I'd just like to take a couple minutes and talk about how to design a water system that I think is, you know, properly suited to how you'll be traveling and kind of tailored to what your needs might be. And I just want to state up front that I think something that goes a long way in plumbing systems is using some like restraint and compromise. And these are two things you do not hear very much, especially I think nowadays in like our van life kind of culture. I think, you know, every product out there, it is being sold by a company that is going to present that as kind of a necessity for like having a van that you enjoy using. And I think a lot of that is just kind of marketing. You know, they'll use words like, you know, overlanding or stealth or even like zombie apocalypse. And all of that is just marketing. Nothing here is absolutely critical for using a van. So to summarize my thoughts about designing a plumbing system properly, I've decided to put together this table. Now there is probably an infinite amount of factors that could go into like trying to perfect a plumbing system, but this table is basically going to touch upon the ones that I find to be most important. At the top of the table, we've got amenities, which I think can also be considered comfort. At the most minimal end, the simplest way to have water in your van is to just carry your water jug. And at the other end, I've seen people put any amenity you have in a regular home. I've even seen like washers and dishwashers. So I think when people design a van, they pretty quickly draw where they want to be on this spectrum, and they don't really consider how that will impact the rest of their van's behavior and performance. I think the most important thing to consider is where do you want to travel? You know, are you going to be trying to get into terrain where a Jeep or a truck is probably better suited, like true off-roading terrain, true 4x4? Or are you going to just be driving some dirt roads where like 4x4 helps but isn't really mandatory? Or are you even just going to be like overlanding and driving on pavement? I think figuring out where you want to travel is the most important thing, and then catering your van to that so it doesn't feel like a hindrance when you can't get to where you had dreamt of getting. Going hand in hand though with those trip destinations is like the climate or like the season you're traveling. If you plan to travel every winter, I would strongly suggest you set up a system that either has some kind of freeze prevention or it's just like really easy to winterize so that like every time you're not using the van in the winter, it's not a big process to kind of shut it down. And then the last part of how you travel, I would call like resupply frequency. And I think the less you want to resupply, the better and better your water use efficiency has to be. And by that I mean more and more of your water just has to be considered drinking water. So if you're planning to mostly travel to places where you want to resupply as little as possible, or it's just really difficult to resupply because these places are really remote, then I think it is sort of a waste to put in things like showers or like a plumbed toilet, because all of those things are just going to be wasting water, which for a lot of your travel then you just won't allow yourself to use because you need to conserve that water. Then I've got three categories here that I think all kind of go hand in hand. I think simplicity, reliability, and then like hassle all go hand in hand. I think a simple system is more reliable. There's just less parts that can fail, less things that can go wrong. And when things don't go wrong, the system just tends to feel much less like a hassle. As well, I think a simple system just generally has a lot less maintenance, like the shutdown procedure is a lot easier, and there's just a lot less upkeep. A lot of this can be also summarized in this category called opportunity cost. By choosing not to install some kind of giant like gray water or black water tank, are you like keeping your ground clearance better so that you can actually off-road? By like not installing a permanent toilet or like plumbed shower, are you helping your van like not feel more claustrophobic or have a lot more storage? And those things are like, that's a good balance to do, is what am I getting by essentially leaving some kind of fancy component out? Then I put monetary cost here and towards the bottom. My big warning here is I see people get fixated to have some kind of amenity, like maybe some fancy hot water heater. And then once cost becomes an issue because they are maybe trying not to spend too much, what those people will often cheap out on is like the tubing, the hose clamps, the fittings, and they'll just buy the cheapest ones they can find. And I think that can lead to just a fairly unreliable system, because now those are kind of common points of failure. And at the end of the day, even with the most fancy hot water heater, if the hose supplying it gets a leak, then you have no hot water heater anyways. So I would definitely recommend you make sure all the nuts and bolts and small bits and pieces are of quality that you install. And then the real last wild card is the installer and the user. You know, I've seen people with outrageous amounts of money buy the most ridiculous components, but just not know what they were doing in the installation process, and as a result just have an unreliable and poorly functioning van. So these are the categories that matter the most to me. So let me just quickly tell you where I fall on these. In terms of off-roading, I know this is a big metal box. It's never going to do as well as my truck, but I would like to keep as much of its off-road performance as it had on the day I bought it. We travel every winter to go skiing or to do stuff in the mountains, so my plumbing system has some built-in freeze prevention, as well as the entire winterizing process is extremely easy. So in the times we're not using the van in the winter, it's just a very fast and simple process to get the whole system drained. And then resupply frequency and like water use efficiency, this is huge to me. I love camping in remote locations, and if I built a van for myself that like couldn't last me 5 days in the backcountry, I would feel like I had failed in the van design. So I have tried to tailor this system towards being as efficient with water as possible. Simplicity and reliability. Everybody wants a reliable system. There's no surprise there. But I think what can go a long ways is just having good installation practices, not having like excess fittings, making sure you are using those quality materials, as I said. In terms of maintenance and hassle, I am far on the left end of this scale. Some people are totally fine having things like a folding dinette to a bed that takes like 3 minutes to convert, or having a folding shower that takes 5 or 10 minutes to deploy. For me, any process that is measured in minutes and not seconds, I'm just not going to do in a van. It's just not a design feature I'm going to take advantage of. So for me, the winterizing process takes like less than 30 seconds. There is no like convertible shower or anything like that in this van, because I just know those are functions I would not take advantage of. In terms of opportunity cost, as I've alluded to in other things I've said, my big goals here were to keep that 4x4 ability, you know, keeping my van nice and nimble, and I think I've accomplished that. And in terms of monetary cost, I always try to use just really quality components throughout, and I'll point out some of those as we're talking about the build here in a bit. So as you can see, I fall essentially on the very far left end of like most of these categories. So I think if I had come into my van design process thinking that I wanted things like a toilet or a shower, those just would be hindrances that would prevent me from traveling to where I want to travel. And at the end of the day, I think that's what matters. Is your van taking you on the trips that you had imagined? Because if it's just a hindrance that doesn't get you to those places, you're probably going to be left in this place where in a year or two, you are now looking for a different vehicle or a different travel vessel. So that's the end of kind of my little preach there on trying to use restraint and being able to compromise a little bit of comfort for just a lot more freedom when traveling. And now let's actually talk about this plumbing install and exactly what I've got installed in here. In a nutshell, here's how it looks. I've got a 20-gallon water tank. It's one of those over-the-wheel well water tanks on the passenger side of the van. And then I've got a faucet, with the sink, but my faucet is controlled actually by a foot pump, which I absolutely love, and we're going to talk about in just a minute. That said, even though we're using a foot pump at our main faucet, out the back doors, I've got an electric water pump with a little spray station. So, if we're really dirty from some kind of mountain adventure or a dog is super dirty, we can hose this off. But, when we don't have access to water for a while, we don't have to use that spray station. That foot pump makes our water use at the sink really efficient. In terms of freeze protection, I've got heating on both kind of all the plumbing lines underneath the sink, as well as on the water tank that'll cover. And then to keep things kind of hassle-free, the entire shutdown winterization process is done by flipping 2 valves, waiting for gravity to drain everything, and then you just got to pump the foot pump a couple times and everything is cleared out. So it's just a very quick, very simple, and I feel extremely reliable water system that I've got. Now let's dive into some of those details, and I'll take you piece by piece as to the most important things that I've done to pull this off. All right, so in the van here, this is the kitchen. Here's our sink, here's our faucet. All the plumbing is just in this cabinet right here essentially, and let's go through it. I think to start with, let's talk about the water tank. All right, so back here in one of the messiest corners of the shop, I've got my water tank. And what's going on right now is I'm essentially got a leak test happening. As you can see, there's some water in here. And I just quickly want to talk about this water tank. This is one of those 20-gallon tanks you can get off of Northwest Conversions. And I like ordering through them because they send me blank tanks with no fittings pre-installed. And then I can just put fittings where I want. So what I've got up here is, this is where my water level sensor will go. Then I've got my main fill, I've got my tank vent, and then this is gonna be like the uptake tube for my like rear spray or shower. What you'll notice is I really like the practice of only having one fitting at the bottom of a tank. And that is right here. And so the advantages of this are, if you've got a leak from your water tank and the fitting is up on top, you know, then that might dribble out a little bit when you're filling, or maybe when you've got some sloshing going on driving. But, you know, little leaks like that are not gonna cause some kind of catastrophic damage in your van. But if you've got a leak out the bottom of your tank, you know, that could drain 20 gallons of water into your van if it's just like parked somewhere and dripping slowly. So I essentially try to always design my tanks with as few holes in the bottom of as possible. So in this tank, I've got just one fitting here at the bottom, and essentially this will branch out into a drain for the tank, and then the other run will go up to my faucet. And the way I've got this installed in the van, I can see this fitting where it's installed, so I can monitor it if I do have a leak. And there is only one failure point in the bottom of this tank, and I think that is a really good kind of design objective if you are able to install your own fittings. I'm gonna put out a little video along with this one that just does a really quick little demo on the parts needed and how to spin weld your own fittings in, if that's something you want to do. All right, so this is the finished installation, and it can be a little difficult to tell what's happening, so I'll be showing some footage here throughout the build, but that one fitting for my water tank is located right there. So if I was to have a drip from that fitting, you know, it would come pretty quickly, be pretty evident right there. Like, none of it is buried very deeply. But that one fitting comes out, and it comes to this, which is a valve assembly that I use for winterizing, which we'll cover in a bit. And then that comes around the bottom and comes to my foot pump. The foot pump out here has a little wood shroud built in, you see. So although that pump is pretty ugly, from this perspective, you know, it just looks like a lever. And then that pumps water back out and up to my faucet. Now, I think foot pumps are one of the best ideas in a van. The design of these Whale Gusher MK3 foot pumps has been unchanged since 1984. So it is a proven design. I mean, you could arguably say that it is timeless. I think the biggest advantage of it is the water conservation standpoint. For any water to come out of your faucet, you have got to actually physically pump that pedal. So you know, when you're washing dishes, you can't just like leave it running and let extra water run out. It helps you conserve and use your water as efficiently as possible, which helps for those long trips out in the backcountry. From a reliability standpoint, we have frozen our foot pump many times throughout the years in our other vans. And most of the time, you know, we go to press that pedal, you can feel the resistance, you don't use it for a little bit, but you warm it up, and then it comes back to life. Once I did freeze it to the point that it ended up having a small drip afterwards, but the rebuild kit to it is about $30, and all you need is a screwdriver to do it. So if you're gonna be camping in the winter extensively, you might as well just throw one of those in your van and know that if you need to fix it, it's a very easy fix on the fly. And then the other way that I think it helps in your reliability is after that water exits the faucet, there is no pressure left in the system. You know, like a standard electric pump, it will pressurize things up to 25 or 50 PSI or whatever pump you bought. And that pressure will just sit there all the time, even when you're not using your water system. However, as a water pump like this, it's a pressureless system. So there's, you know, if you were to get a pinhole leak somewhere, there's just gravity that might be feeding water out. You don't have that pressure that's just trying to push all that water out. Now, and then one last advantage of the foot pump is I think it is relatively quieter than an electric pump. So while an electric pump, you know, will cycle on about every time you end up using your sink, this thing, I think every one you buy has a little bit of a creak towards the end of the stroke, but that is, I think, a lot more quiet than the like cycling on and off of the pump. All right, and if you watch the operation of this thing, it pumps out water on the downstroke, and then as it's returning on the upstroke as well. And each of those pumps, let's see, is about 4 or 5 ounces. So that's about how much water you get out of each stroke. So, you know, usually within about 10 strokes, you can get an enraging filled. So it is quite fast if you want it to be. All right, and while we're standing here, Let's quickly talk about sinks and faucets. Now, I really like these in-wall faucets, and the reason I can use these is because using that foot pump, there's no valves or switches or anything to use up here. You know, like I don't have to turn my water flow on. And as a result, I've got nothing extra poking out of the top of my countertop. So I really like how clean of a counter these in-wall faucets use. And then if I don't want to use this thing, you know, you can fold it out of the way. And I just think it's a really nice design. I've used these faucets in a few vans. And then let's talk stainless steel sinks. I really like undermounting my sink, as you see here. And I have found that if you can find a sink with one of these 2-inch drains instead of the standard like 4-inch drains, you can actually use those Ambassador Marine sink drains, which I think are just the lowest profile solution, and it's high quality, and it just leaves you with more storage space underneath your sink. However, there's only a couple companies that actually make these stainless steel sinks with the smaller drains. You can hunt around for some prep or bar sinks, and some of them have them as well. But the two big brands are Ambassador Marine and Scandivic, and they are both quite pricey. There's one other sink I like to use, which is this one, but in this van it didn't fit. However, this sink is actually straight off of eBay and from, I think, Lithuania maybe, or Slovenia. And as a result, I paid about half price for it. Now the difference between these, I think, cheap stainless sinks and the fancy stainless sinks, you'll find is this noise decoupling. So while this was bare stainless steel on the outside, this one's got this like rubbery coating, and you see it has like some sound deadening pads. And that way when the water lands in it, it doesn't have like this clingy, resonant quality to it. But here's a cheap solution for a cheap sink. Like this one, if you clank, here we'll actually use the metal end. You know, on this main padding, it's very kind of sound dampened. Otherwise, it's got a little bit of dampening. How about this cheap sink now? I mean, it's better than this sink. And how did I pull this off? Well, I just coated the outside of this in those same vibration reducing panels that people use within the rest of their van as they're building them out. So if you buy a cheap sink, but you want it to sound like an expensive sink, which is really, I think, the only difference you'll find between the two, just throw some of those pads on the outside of it and it works just the same. Okay, so at the back of the van, we've got kind of the hose off, spray off station that I was talking about. And you know, the water tank comes up to here, and the whole water pump and everything is housed just above it in this little space up here. It's super compact, and by doing this, I feel like I haven't lost very much storage space at all. Now, in order to use this, I use a couple hoses that I just store in my back door here. And once you pull them off, they have these quick connect fittings that are used for the hose systems. So on the spray side, you just take this thing and you can click it on right there. And then that way, once you're ready to run your water, this is ready to go. And this valve piece, what I've got going on here, is if you've got it placed upright like this, then it is going to pull in from this fitting right here. But if I have it down like this, then it is going to pull from my fresh water tank. So if we're camping somewhere where it's pretty easy to get more water, you know, we can just use our same fresh water in order to run this hose nozzle. And if we're camping in the mountains, you know, we can use this kind of auxiliary input. So if we can like fill a 5-gallon jug with some river water, then we can use that at the spray station here. Now, a big piece of advice I have for electric water pumps is to try to find one with like the lowest pressure and the lowest gallon per minute you can if you want to conserve water. The pump I've got in here is a 35 PSI, 2 gallons per minute rated, and I feel like it has plenty of water flow for like a shower system in a van. So I really like these quick disconnect fittings. They have a nice and like comfortable thumb lattice. These things self-seal when they are not being used. They've got these little dimples that these things press in. So they just click on if you want to use them. And then one last little detail here. If you look in here, there's actually 3 buttons right here. And I've made the water switch button kind of hard to hit. That way, like when we're camping and we've got a bunch of cargo in the back here, I'm not worried about something like rolling into this and accidentally turning on my water pump. These other 2 operate lights, so I'm not as concerned if those get turned on, but I just don't want my water pump accidentally being turned on. All right, being in the back here, if we just come around to this outside wall, what we've got over here is our water fill. Now this is one of those Fiamma key lockable fills. I've had good luck with these and I just like these in general, but one thing to note about water fills is I've seen people recently kind of put what they call like stealth water fills underneath their van, that you actually need pressure to push water up into the tank. And although I can see the advantage of trying to maybe try to be stealthy or something, I think you're not really being that stealthy in a big box van. And I would always recommend a gravity fill. The reason for this is you're going to eventually get to a place where you cannot find, you know, a spigot or something to hook a hose up to. So you may find yourself pouring water jugs into these things. If you've got something that you need pressure to drive water into, then you cannot just pour water jugs in. So you may find yourself in a spot where you can't get more water in your tank. So I would highly recommend a gravity fill option. And if you absolutely want it to be stealthy, then my suggestion would be to just like put the port inside the van here. That way you just always have to open your back doors to fill it, which isn't really that big of a deal if you don't want to cut a hole in the side of your van. And then the last advantage of having this kind of spray system back here is if we set this upright so it is pulling in water from this port, if we are at a place where we can't get a hose to fill that large water tank, we could, use one of these jugs, get some fresh water there, set this to pull water from there, and then our actual shower nozzle, I would run around the side and then use that to fill our main water tank, which is what I did when I had to leak test this system after getting it installed. All right, let's talk about monitoring water level. So in this van, I've actually installed another Serbo compatible unit, which is a KUS water level sensor. Now you could just run this analog and not go through the Serbo, but you can program the Serbo for non-standard water tanks. The rate from that sensor as it travels up the metal tube is not linear with how much water is actually in the tank. So yet to be done, but supposedly you can program this because, with that over the wheel well shape, a large volume of that water tank is kind of like the last 20% of the height of the tank. So hopefully we'll be able to program this so that the percentage display on the screen is accurate. But when actually filling the tank, I have found it's really helpful to just have some place you can glance at the water tank. So I ended up cutting this slot right here. And then that way, as we're filling this up and we're just packing the rest of the van, we can just quickly monitor how much water level we have. And you can actually see the very top of the tank right there. So we'll know when it's full. So although that we'll be using the Serbo for like day-to-day monitoring how much water we have, we will be using this gauge for when we're just quickly glancing at it when we're getting it filled up. Okay, so let's talk gray water systems. Coming from the evolution of kind of like camping in a tent to then camping in a truck, camping in a minivan, and now camping in a full-size van, I'm kind of the mentality that if the only stuff you're putting down your faucet are water and maybe like Dr. Bronner's soap, you have about the same impact as like a backpacker. And in my view, that is fine. That said, as we've gotten older, sometimes we'll be in busy parking lots and it can just be kind of awkward to have water dumping out the bottom of your van. So this van does have a small little 3-gallon gray water tank. In the winter, we will not use our gray water tank because if it did freeze, that would obviously cause problems and damage. But during the summer, I've set it up so from within the van, we just have this one of these remote lever kits or remote valve kits. So we can just pull that to close the valve and then push it to open the valve. So from within the van here, that's the entire system. It's just this one lever that opens and closes the gray water tank. And when this thing is pushed in as it is right now, the gray water tank is closed and then we can pull it and then the water will start draining as you hear. Then we close it like that. That's all we need to do to open and close our gray water tank. And let me show you what it looks like outside. All right, so we're underneath the van now. That blue pipe you see coming out, that's actually the same sink faucet drain that we saw on the other side of the van. And then that little metal bracket in front of it, that actually holds the cable that opens and closes our valve. So it runs out and then comes to our valve assembly right here. Now if we follow that blue hose around, it ends up actually coming through this body member and then comes out this other side down to this little T-junction here where it either drains through this valve or when it's closed like it is right now, it basically ends up backfilling this piece of PVC all the way up to our gray water tank, which is over there. Now this gray water tank fits just perfectly between kind of these two frame rails. It's a snug fit, so I'm glad it fit because I wasn't 100% sure when I ordered it, but it almost just seems perfect. So that's got a slight angle to it so that, it will drain out the back here through this tube when this valve is open. And in case that starts to overflow, I did drill a couple tiny holes in the top of it, so water will just start kind of dribbling out of that if we end up having too much gray water. But overall, this is just a very low profile system. No component hangs lower than the driveline, and as a result, it just doesn't impede our off-roading ability at all. It's a very small system and does exactly what we want. And now let's talk freeze prevention. So tucked against a water tank right over here, I've actually got a temperature sensor. So everything here is basically controlled by my Serbo GX. But essentially when that temperature gets to less than 37 degrees along the side of the tank, the Serbo tells the relay to kick on, and then my water heater can be run. Now, this extra switch here, I did not originally plan to use this. Along all the tubing down here, I've got this 12-volt heat tape that uses about 5 watts per meter, and I actually ended up using close to 8 feet of this in order to basically wrap this full run, as well as get a wrap around the water pump, and then also get the run all the way up to the faucet. So I'm drawing about 40 watts right there, which is, about 3.5 amps. And then the actual tank heater is drawing about 6 amps there. So I'm pushing close to 10 amps for my tubing heaters and my tank heater. And for the tank heater, I use one of these Faucets heaters that you can buy almost anywhere now. They've become quite popular. The reason I like these heat tape and I like that heating pad is that these are both self-regulating, where that heating pad cuts out, I think, about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and then this heat tape cuts out at a hotter temperature than ideal, which is 85 Celsius, but that temperature is still not so hot that it's actually going to damage anything. And then the reason all of this looks the way it does is I've essentially insulated all of it so that heat tape, it actually has a chance to help this when it gets really cold. So everything is now wrapped in this insulation. And then for the actual foot pump itself, I found the easiest thing to use is just more of that 3M90 insulation. You just kind of wrap it over. And then I like to use these little Velcro electrical ties to secure as much of my insulation, and actually this 3M90 as well. The advantage of this stuff is it's just Velcro. So if I need to inspect anything or if I need to fix anything, I can remove that insulation without having to destroy it. All right, let's talk winterizing and shutdown procedure. As I alluded earlier, I dislike complicated tasks in the van. So the only thing I need to do to winterize this is, now that it's all wrapped in insulation, it can be kind of hard to see, but that kind of valve manifold that I pieced together, it actually has 2 little blue valves on the side here. All right, so this is kind of I'm gonna smooth this over a little. This is the final manifold design I've decided on. This goes through the floor. So the way this works is it will be positioned horizontally, like this is the ground. The water flows from the water tank through this fitting. When this is horizontal, this valve right here is closed. When we open it, this will be the low point. Water will flow out. Then from here, we'll exit out to the foot pump. And then the foot pump the outlet of the foot pump that's going up to the faucet will come in here and then continue through up to the faucet. So when this is closed, the water will flow through. And when this is open, then everything from the faucet, drains down through here. And then all the discharge from the foot pump as you're trying to get the water out of it also comes down through here into the ground. So that is my kind of gravity drain valve system. So after you've got all the water out of the fresh water tank and you've got all the water out of this faucet run, we essentially just have to pump the foot pump a couple times, and then whatever water is left in there will just get put straight back down into this tube, which is set to drain out the floor. And then in that way, there is essentially, you flip 2 valves, maybe on your drive home, you just let all that drain out, and then you just got to pump the foot pump a couple times, and the entire process is done. It's all gravity drain. There's no antifreeze. There's no using an air compressor to get water out of the lines. It's just as simple as can be, and I find that this is just a great headache saver and just makes living as a weekend warrior in the winter nice and easy. Now for this manifold thing, I like these little 3-way valves. These are actually made by Specialty Manufacturing Company, but you can get quite a few iterations of them from MacMaster, as well as I believe usplastics.com. And they're basically these little valves where it's a straight connection through, and when you flip the 3rd valve, then that kind of opens it. I think they might be called sampling valves or something. All right, let's talk tubing. I am not a fan of PEX, and I think the main reason is because you can't see through it. Now, I also think that it's not very maneuverable. It's hard to feed through spaces. I find this Nilo flume you can get from US Plastics, which is rated for drinking water, with a little heat, you can make really nice tight bends instead of having to use those 90-degree connectors, which essentially means, I think in freezing conditions, it is always the fitting that bursts. The hoses, they can take that 9% expansion as water freezes, but it's always those rigid plastic or metal fittings that will break when stuff freezes. So I like clear hoses because if you get some funk or some gunk in your tubing, It's easy to see where it is. If you do get some kind of blockage, you can actually see where it is. So I think even though a lot of the tubing in the front of my van is wrapped in insulation, if I was having issues, then I could just quickly peel that insulation back and diagnose any kind of problems I have with my tubing. So for all my freshwater ones, I primarily use this 1/2-inch nylofilm from US Plastics. And for all my drain lines, I like this stuff that I believe is called Tiger Flex. I bought kind of an industrial amount of this, so I'll probably be using it till I die, but I just like it too. It can also bend very nicely without collapsing on itself, and it's just a nice and durable plastic. So Tiger Flex and Nyloflume, or just really any clear plastic. This stuff that's not braided, if you try to make tight bends with it, it will collapse, but it's fine too. Anyways, I just like clear tubing. I think it makes diagnosing or just even being aware of anything weird going on with your water system a lot easier. But at the back of the van here, I actually use this Flexzilla stuff, which you can't see through, but it's just for these couple short runs here. I have found Flexzilla hoses to just be so much more nice and supple. So even in cold temperatures, I can expect to not be fighting these things. I to try to move them around. And this is actually their like 1/2-inch air designed hose. But I think, since this isn't permanently sitting in water, I'm not really worried about like any chemical leaching if that was to be a worry. And I actually think the main difference with this is that it is rated to 300 PSI because it is designed for higher pressure systems. But I just had some of this laying around, so I used the Flexzilla stuff. I just really like how resilient it is and how supple. Now, I use regular hose clamps everywhere in my system. I'm a big fan of Breeze hose clamps. I've just found it to be consistent and I can torque down on them when I need. But when I've got some kind of part that I will actually be interacting with, I really like these kind of hose clamps with the little C-clips that you got to pinch down. Now these are a lot harder to service. You'd have to cut these if you needed to do something with this. But unlike a regular hose clamp, I feel like to your hand, there's nothing that can scratch you. It doesn't get caught on nearly as much stuff. And I just prefer these for any kind of components that you're actually going to be like physically handling versus something like a fixed piece of plumbing, like how we've got up here. Those, I'm not going to be running my hands through there very often, and it's nice to be able to service things easily. But anything you're actually going to be kind of dealing with, I just prefer these fittings a lot more to avoid any kind of abrasion or, discomfort. Small details. I think it makes the big difference. All right, and this is just the last tip I've got for you, which is leak testing. Now, I think if you've got an electric pump in your van, one of the best signs you have is that it is cycling on for really short periods of time, even when you haven't been using the system. Now, if you've got really long water runs and you've got like a kind of a higher pressure pump, maybe a 50 PSI unit, a lot of your tubing and hosing will stretch just a smidgen. So if it kind of recycles once after it's expanded those hoses, I'd say that's like a behavior you'll learn and it's fine. But I think if you've got a really small, slow leak somewhere else in your system, like the most easy way to know that that's happening is as you're just hanging out, every hour, every 3 hours, your pump will recycle back on for just a little bit. Now, there is a chance that you've just got something wrong with your pump and it is losing pressure. But if this is a brand new installation, I think that better points that unfortunately somewhere you've just got a really slow leak that is just pushing out a little bit of water. So that is something that I always watch for. I just leave my pump on as the van build is being done in the shop. And if I start to hear just a very short cycle back on, that tells me that there is a loss of pressure somewhere in the system, and that indicates a problem. However, my other method is once you've got everything installed and you're doing your kind of leak test, I like to line any area that you might have a leak with these blue paper towels, like mechanics towels. Let me show you. Okay, so these blue paper towels, I have found that if you get any water on them, like if we can just, maybe that's a big drop, but even like the tiniest little drops over here, the color of these just changes drastically whenever you get any water on them. So to me, if I see this, and as long as I made sure wherever I installed these was perfectly dry before I put them in there, because sometimes when you are actually installing your water system, you have tested your pump before, or you've tested something else, so it's a little wet, you get a little splash on the ground somewhere, you put one of these towels on it, an hour later, you're left wondering, wait, am I leaking or did I accidentally forget to clean the area well enough? So if you can make sure where you're placing these is 100% dry, I find kind of lining that surface with these blue paper towels can just be really helpful to just quickly see, any of these spots indicates I've got a water leak. So blue paper towels, I think, are a great way to identify water leaks. And that's all I've got to say about plumbing at this point. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching this video and listening to me ramble. And hopefully you learned something. And once again, just thanks so much for watching.